Hi everyone, welcome to the third episode of my web series, A Positive Response. I have a really special guest today. Her name is Schaefer, and she is an attorney with the American Bar Association's Death Penalty Representation Project. Amazing. She is here today to talk to us about the relationship between violence, punishment, and masculinity. And as you guys know, this is a really important subject matter. And what I love about Laura being here and talking about it is that she's not necessarily going to address it from an academic kind of sociology kind of point of view, but she's really addressing it from a lawyer and criminal point of view, and she has hands-on experience. Without saying much more, I would like to hand it to Laura.
Really honored to be doing this because I'm half Turkish. My mother is Turkish, and this is something that needs to be recognized as an issue and something that we really need to focus. And I think this is what you're doing with this video series, which is so fantastic, is okay, how can we approach this from different angles, and how can we think about different ways of addressing this incredibly difficult issue, which is this phenomenon of femicide in Turkey. So to sort of give a little context from the perspective that I'm going to be coming from, and I'm a lawyer, I'm an attorney in the United States, and I've actually worked in criminal defense for basically the entirety of the time that I've been an attorney, 7 years now. And specifically, I've been working in the area of death penalty defense. And what our project does is we work with lawyers around the country who are responsible for defending people who have been charged with death penalty crimes. And we provide them with assistance in different areas. I focus specifically on clemency, which is the ability to sort of get mercy from a governor or from a board, but different areas of death penalty law. And one thing, the first thing that kind of struck me that's interesting to think about in the context of the work that I do, and thinking about it in the context of the issue that we're thinking about more generally with femicide and violence against women, is that the most important task of any death penalty defense team and any death penalty attorney is always to understand why the crime happened, right? That is, and you would think that that is something that is, you know, what the prosecutor is doing or what the police is doing, but really they don't need to go that deep on the question, right? They need to prove that the crime happened. And to a certain extent, they might need to prove certain aspects of the crime that make it worse or more dramatic in order to get a death penalty conviction. But what the defense attorneys are doing, what the people we're working with are doing, is really trying to get to the bottom of, like, how did this person come to this moment in their life where they committed this incredibly violent act? How can that happen, and how can we explain that? And that's the reason why you need to understand why this happened, is because the job of the defense attorneys is to be able to explain to people, you know, there are reasons why people commit these incredible acts of violence. It's not just, you know, you're not just possessed by evil all of a sudden and something takes over. There are factors that you can identify that are very consistent in the backgrounds of people who commit violent acts. We used to see the death penalty in the first half of the 20th century in the United States really being used as a way to police sexual politics and sort of reinforce the victim, you know, reinforce the capacity of women to be victims and the need of society to sort of violently intervene to protect them, which I think are sort of masculine and male tropes that can translate in other settings and in other contexts into acts of violence. When we start trying to understand why people got to where they were to commit a death penalty offense, we do sometimes, or we should do it all the time, but resources allowing, we try to do multi-generational trauma histories, because we start to see that trauma actually is carried through generations, that you often, once you start digging, you see not only that the perpetrator themselves has had this trauma background, but that their parents had this trauma background, that their grandparents, so there is something sort of inherited there. But so you often see childhood trauma, neglect, and then you just see so many social factors in these people's backgrounds, which are often poverty, experiences of structural racism, institutionalization at a very early age, involvement with the criminal justice system as a way of sort of institutionalizing kids rather than addressing issues with kids in a more sort of productive, empathetic way. And then you start to see, mental illness, intellectual disability, substance abuse issues. I mean, all of these issues are intertwined, but what's sort of amazing is that you have all of these different cases all around the country, and you start just seeing these common themes. And this is where I want to sort of think about, the idea of punishment as it relates to violence, because I think one of the things that is most problematic about, I think, the way that the US responds to violence is we have this idea that you can just punish once violence has been committed, and that will somehow make all the difference, that the death penalty is a deterrent. And if you have the death penalty, it's going to keep people from committing violent crimes. That's not what happens. The US is an incredibly violent place, and we have an incredibly punitive criminal justice system, right? We put a lot of people in prison. We execute a lot of people compared to other similar democratic countries, and it is not addressing our violence problem. I actually think that there is a different sort of relationship between violence and the death penalty, which is that when you have a state that's willing to enact this violence on its citizens at the highest level as a response for punishment, that sort of gives a signal through society that violence is an acceptable response, right? I think you're sort of modeling on a state level something that you don't want your citizens to be seeing. And that's one of the things that when I was thinking about this in the context of femicide, in the context of Turkey, that I think is sort of interesting. I mean, there's something about these authoritarian governments and appeals to these like violent punishments that I think starts to resonate in society. What it says to me is that people aren't born bad. People aren't born violent. There are things that happen along the way. There are ways that societies operate that create the conditions for violence. I mean, there's something about these authoritarian governments and appeals to these like violent punishments that I think starts to resonate in society.
If you look at the study from 2018, you see that the researchers identified various factors that have a statistically significant correlation with likelihood to be subject to domestic violence. And the factors that they pointed out are low educational level, and this is on the part of the woman, low income, young marriage age, fragmented family type, spouse's age, low educational level of spouse, and subjection to violence. And I think this is the spouse having been subject to violence in his background. These are the factors that are associated with a greater likelihood of domestic violence in a relationship. And what strikes me about these factors is that these are the types of social factors that if society were interested not just in punishment, not just in reacting after the fact, after the crime has been committed, but also trying to understand how can we start to reduce this crime to begin with? How can we start to ensure that fewer women are going to be subject to this terrible violence? We can start to think about, okay, can we find a way of addressing these factors? So for example, with low educational level, young marriage age, if society wants to start prioritizing for women their ability to continue on with their education, to receive higher levels of education, if that's sort of prioritized on a societal level, more so than, for example, being married at a young age, and that would address the young marriage age, what the data suggests is that might start to correlate with reduced rates of domestic violence. So if you start to look at things from not just a punishment-based perspective, not just how do we deal with the person once they've committed the crime, but you start to look at crime from the perspective of what are the societal factors that lead to it, then I think there's a way of starting to make these positive interventions and potentially also reducing the incidence of violence. But that has to be something that society is willing to prioritize, something that governments are willing to prioritize and say, we're actually going to take into account the fact that there are these shared social situations, social characteristics that we can identify as being correlated with violence. And some of the emphasis on punishment is always saying, okay, let's look at the individual perpetrator and let's not look at these larger background issues. And that's easier for society. It's less to fix if you say, I'm just going to punish this individual person, but does it actually result in a decrease in violence? And my perspective, it does not.
What it says to me is that people aren't born bad. People aren't born violent. There are things that happen along the way. There are ways that societies operate that create the conditions for violence. And we can fix that. That's something we can address. Whereas, the luck of the draw with genetics, we can't really do much about that. Trying to convince a jury or a judge, maybe you don't have to execute this person. Look at this history, understand this context, try to understand how they got to this point. Now, I will say from what I've seen in the femicide issue of Turkey, you have from on high, and I think this is sort of what we're seeing with the trends, there's kind of a whispering, kind of a trickle of information that is getting into people's heads that sort of, this isn't the kind of crime that society is that worried about. Maybe it's okay if you're really sort of passionate and you act out against a woman in this way. I don't want to say that there can be no punishments for femicide in Turkey or something, that it would only create more violence. It's a both and, only punishment is never the solution, because only punishment is never going to stop it from happening again, because that's not the way violence works. That's not the way people commit violent crimes. It's not the way they think about it. And I know this from having represented people who have committed very, very violent crimes, and that's just not a thought process that goes through their head before they kind of have that reactive moment. Violent crime is far and away committed by men. It's just not a phenomenon that you really see among women. That's not to say that women don't commit acts of violence. Sometimes they do, but when you look at the percentages, you're looking at, between 70 and 90% of violent crimes are committed by men. Basically making masculinity so fragile, making it so scary for a man to feel as though anything about him is being threatened, but in particular, maybe the manliness is being threatened, and you combine that with an inability, without giving men tools to experience these feelings and think about productive ways in which to have an outlet for this, and what it sort of turns into is just a reaction. And when you have just a reaction, that's when you're more likely to have these acts of violence. And then when you have a whole society that basically says that men have to behave in a certain way, men have to be strong in a certain way, and men don't actually understand how to deal with all of the feelings that they have that are very similar to all the feelings that women have. Again, it's the human condition of having feelings, but they don't have an outlet for this. And what they're also then seen as modeling is, like, you have society modeling violence on a very high level. You have society sort of indicating that violence actually can be in some ways an act of manliness. You need to give them an outlet and an avenue for that to be expressed. And if you have a society that says that men shouldn't be expressing their feelings in this way, it can sort of twist and turn and manifest in these acts of violence. So those would be opportunities sort of for intervention. How are we teaching young men to express themselves, to feel about themselves as men, to feel about women? These are patterns that we can look for that I think can make a real difference. I see the urge of punishment as being this very reactive thing that I attribute to, in fact, a pretty masculine response to issues in society, right? I see that as sort of like, you're not looking at the underlying issues, you're not getting into the feelings of it, you're not trying to explore, you're just saying, I need to just come down on this. And I see that also as something that's somewhat symbolic of the way we consider men should be responding to things. But what's particularly also interesting, and I think one way in which it plays out on a very micro level, is that in the work that we do, in social justice work, it's almost all women. There are some men who do this work, and more in sort of death penalty cases can be seen as sort of sexy by some. So you get like a few more men in death penalty law, but in social justice work and work where you're saying, okay, I'm not going to be paid a lot of money. I'm not doing this for corporate interests. I'm doing this because I want to make a difference in society. And I think I can. Women are the ones doing that work. We're 80% of our conferences. My entire office is women, and that's not to say that men don't care about these things, but there obviously is some sort of social structure that's saying that women are the ones who are supposed to care, and women are the ones who are supposed to do the understanding, and men are the ones who are supposed to react or something. But I think it's very interesting that women are consistent, we're often the victims. We're harassed, we're oppressed, we're attacked, but at the same time, in doing this kind of work in the United States, we're the ones who are trying to understand why, and who are trying to explain, why did that man do that? Why did that man act violently?
I mean, you bring up really extremely sad, but like extremely brilliant point. I mean, I think this is really what the core of the problem is.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not, we will answer the call and we will do it because it has to be done and because we see that it has to be done, but we should not be doing it alone. The men need to be doing this too.
I agree more. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you so much. Such a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.